Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this keynote conversation with Jelte van Wieren. Jelte is the director of the Stabilization and Humanitarian Aid Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And Jelte is not just your average diplomat. Through the years that I've known him, I know him as somebody who is never fully satisfied with the status quo. He's one of those people that always questions, pushes, urges, and asks if things could be done better and differently. In other words, I find him a friend innovator in the way he approaches his work. We're going to have a conversation about the Dutch approach to strengthening justice and rule of law globally. Welcome, Jelte.
Thank you.
Jelte, let's start off. If we look at the world today, we see a ring of instability around Europe. An increase in conflict, humanitarian crisis. We have migration, we have terrorism, and in many of the countries around us, fast-growing young populations. And I was just wondering, how do these challenges affect foreign policy of the Netherlands?
Well, in many ways, I would say. But before I do that, and you were just saying that I like to correct things if possible, let's just use one of your phrases and go down into that first, because one of the things that is really impacting the way that we form policy and try and implement and solve problems is that most of the issues that we talk about right now, the migration crisis and the ring of instability, are all framed in a very negative way. Why is there a migration crisis? Migration has been there always for a long time. Why is it now suddenly perceived to be such a big crisis? The ring of instability gives a very Eurocentric sort of perception about security, as if insecurity is something that was recently invented and Europe is now becoming the first victim. I think it's all in matters of framing. It could be done in a different way, because if things are more focused on the facts instead of the political framing around those facts, we could come up with more positive and creative solutions as well. But anyway, I think you're right in saying that conflict is on the rise again. I think that's one of the conclusions that we can easily draw. It has been going down for a long time, but the last number of years, 5, 6 years, we see that conflict is indeed again on the rise. And unfortunately for us, here in Europe, a lot of them quite near. And I think also if you look at the situation with regard to forced displacement, around 65.5 million people have now been forcibly displaced from their homes, and about 23 million of them have become refugees, forced to leave their own country to look for security somewhere else. And the number of conflict deaths, I think, is also, again, on the increase. 4 countries right now are on the brink of starvation, something that we haven't seen in a long time. And all of the issues, all of the situations where these people are now on the brink of starvation, these conflicts have been human-caused, man-made, instead of nature-made. And I think these are all signs of the times that we have to deal with. And indeed, we've seen significant refugee flows to Europe, indeed, and it's causing a lot of problems. But there again, I think we have to be careful with the figures. I mean, just to imagine, if you look at legal migration into the EU, the yearly figure right now is around 2.7, 2.8 million people. Only 7% of that figure is illegal or irregular migration. The rest is just people coming to Europe in a legal status, as students, as workers, etc. So the issue may not be as dramatic as some people would claim it to be. And I think also if you look at the situation in Europe, people are becoming more and more afraid. And people in the street, and I recognize and see why, because things like extremism, terrorism, radicalization is out there. It's in the streets, it's in the cities of all of Europe right now. And this is a scary prospect, because it could touch anyone. And I think that's why these challenges that are there are indeed also challenges for policymakers like me and like us. Now, if you look at our stabilization policy, the stabilization policy of the Netherlands, one of the crucial elements of that is that we recognize that any solution to any of these complex problems should be integrated, in the sense that it needs different elements of government working together and finding comprehensive solutions and comprehensive approaches. You know, in the field of security and stabilization, we call it the 3D approach. So combining defense, diplomacy, and development in comprehensive packages by trying to cater for all sides of the conflict. I think even these 3 Ds is not enough. There should be more added to it, but at least it should be combined. And we also recognize that there are very strong linkages between some of the issues that you mentioned in my CV: humanitarian affairs, stabilization issues, including rule of law issues, and migration. A lot of these problems are interlinked. Insecurity in countries is causing irregular migration to happen, and vice versa. So these things should also be dealt with in combination. But it's not all negative. We also have opportunities, and I think very interesting and new opportunities. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals that have been agreed on an international level, very fortunate, we're very happy with the fact that one of these SDGs is on just and true and safe societies, peaceful societies. And that's really helpful because it focuses the world and international development input on creating that part of a necessary underground for development and tackling some of these complex problems. However, it's not enough. If you look at all these integrated policy things, I think we haven't come to solutions that really make a difference. And personally, I really believe, and you said it already, is that we need to become much more innovative in the way we think about problems, perceive problems, look at it from the outside and come up with really new things. But it also entails a big risk. Because if you work on innovation, you also count in the fact that things you try out can fail. And in my personal opinion, and in a growing opinion within the government, things should be allowed to fail. But if they fail, they have to fail fast and we have to find a different route. And in that way, we will come to new solutions, using new partnerships, including, for instance, cooperating with the private sector much better than we've done in the past, but also including other new partners that we haven't even thought about before. So maybe just to give you one example of a very strange partnership.
Please do.
Working on the humanitarian, as I said, we have discovered that one of the big problems in trying to get innovations to come to scale in humanitarian work is it's very, very difficult to test out innovations, technical innovations or other innovations, because you don't fool around and you don't play in a real humanitarian crisis with the situation of people there. So we were searching for an alternative venue where we could do this. And a lot of innovations need to be tested and developed further. So we forged a relationship with the creative sector in the Netherlands. And I don't know if you know what that is, but that is these people that organize these huge dance events all around the world. You know, where you have the house music and you have 20, 30, 50,000 people gathering together over a few days, enjoying music and all sorts of other things. Now you can imagine that in these situations, crowd management, sanitation, mobile payment systems, making sure that all these people have to eat and drink, need to be organized. We use these venues to test out humanitarian innovations that are particularly relevant for receiving large numbers of refugees in the same area all at once. And it's really successful. You know, we can benefit from the knowledge of companies that are in a commercial way trying to get into these areas and test their own inventions. And it really helps the humanitarian sector to become innovative, and they have a safe place to try it out. Because there are no lives at stake, and it's easier to do that. This kind of weird, you know, it seems quite weird for somebody in the humanitarian sector to do that, but it's really effective. And that's the way forward, I think.
It's brilliant. It's, you know, dancing your way to a peaceful
Absolutely.
world. Very good. A key word in what you're saying, Jelte, is stabilization. And what have the Dutch learned? What are the Dutch ingredients to get to stabilization in so-called fragile environments?
Right. Yeah. I think it's a very important question, Sam, because one of the issues that is easily taken in the wrong way in unstable areas is if you put a too one-dimensional approach from a military or a security perspective on that situation.
Right.
We've learned from our mistakes in the past, and we've learned from experience in areas where that didn't work. So what we've done, for instance, in my department, we've developed the theory of change, where we focus on a way to deal with these complex problems in a much more comprehensive way, and also to learn from our experience as we go along. And central in that approach is the concept social contract. Countries in a situation of long-term fragility are essentially characterized by a very sharp social polarization, little social cohesion amongst different groups in society. And that is reflected in disrupted relationships between the government and the people. We call that a weak social contract. Now, there's no legitimate governance to guarantee everyone's safety and to ensure fair access to employment, natural resources, public services, and prosperity. And in fact, in some of these cases, in some of these countries, the state itself is part of the reason why there is a weak social contract, because they prey on their own citizens through corruption, repression, and other issues. And the other way around, if repression and a lack of future perspectives are both identified as major sources of migration. So there again, you have an interconnection which you need to deal with. So in focusing on solutions, we have come up with the term of legitimate stability, which means it's not about stability only, it's not preserving the status quo, but it's finding a way to bring countries at peace, communities at peace with each other and with themselves under the framework of a legitimate form of government and legitimate institutions. And I think that is the crucial part in which we work. And at the same time, we are very strong believers that in these situations, your main counterparts are obviously governments, because we are a government, so we deal with governments on the other side. But in doing that, we have to put the citizen at the center of what we do. This is a crucial element of our policies. So we put human security above state security in our approaches in unstable situations. Now, to promote legitimate stability in fragile countries with a view to resolving and preventing armed conflict, protecting people and laying the foundations for sustainable development, we believe that there are a couple of aspects that are key. First of all, I said it already, human security instead of state security, focusing on the people and their security needs and perceptions. The second one is rule of law, obviously. And the third one is inclusive political processes ranging from mediation to peace building. And all of these measures should be complemented by economic and social reconstruction or the provision of basic services, because people need to live. And I think if you look at some of the programs that we do in some countries, I think countries like Mali, South Sudan, those are excellent examples of trying to combine all these elements into a comprehensive approach.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I could disclose that we work with some of your people in Mali, where I see this coming together really well. But let's just focus a little more on this rule of law aspects. If you were to say, what are some of the key elements of the rule of law assistance that the Dutch government gives, maybe in comparison to other states, given this approach? What would those be?
Yeah, but if you allow me, I will just go back to a very personal experience that I've had. And I was in different postings abroad, and two of those was in South Africa and in Kenya. Both in these countries I worked on rule of law issues. And in Kenya we had organized a workshop by a guy who really became a good friend of me later, Piet Biesheuvel, who is English but with a very Dutch name. Anyway, he was a trainer in a rule of law workshop, and the first thing he did when the meeting started was to put two pictures on a screen. On the left-hand side you saw a whitewashed building with a small tower and some palm trees. And on the right-hand building, you saw an African landscape with a baobab tree. And then he would ask the participants in the course, thinking about rule of law, what do you see? And then the discussion started about, obviously the left one is a courthouse. And people recognize that. So most of the rule of law practitioners in that room would go for the courthouse. And the right one, the baobab tree, people were confused. What do you want to hear from us? This is a baobab tree, it's nature, it's a gathering place of communities. And then he would, at the end, come back and he'd say, no, in terms of efficiency, this baobab tree is far more important than the courthouse. Because in the countries that we work in, more than 80% of rule of law issues, of justice issues, are being dealt with under a baobab tree instead of in a courthouse. To me, that was something which made it very clear why we have to have a broader view. And I think if you look in this room, I think we could all easily agree that the lack of formal or informal legal systems to which people can bring their grievances is actually a threat to security. And it may lead to conflict, and it often does. Access to effective, legitimate justice enables peaceful settlement of disputes and reduces the likelihood that conflicts are settled in a violent manner. And there is a very close relationship, in our view, between rule of law and development. Legal certainty fosters investment. And in turn, this creates development and enterprise. And that's what all the countries need. At the same time, as I said before, we want to put the citizen at the center. To strengthen the legitimacy of the legal system with the public, people's wishes and needs should play a crucial and a central part. The justice needs and satisfaction surveys that we do together with you, with Hill, are in different countries, are a very big part of this. We need more data to understand the justice journeys of individual, ordinary citizens in order to come to the core of what is needed in a country. Now, for instance, in many societies, people rely, as I said, on informal justice systems more than they do on formal systems. Now, if you, for instance, look at Ukraine, even a country like Ukraine, only 5% of the persons said that they trust courts to resolve their legal problems. Now, this kind of knowledge, including on perceptions, can be very useful for programming, and we try and use that wherever we can. The data also tell us that much instability and discontent is connected to millions and millions of people who face what some would call relatively small injustices every single day. In most countries, the most prevalent justice needs are less connected with serious grievances like torture or murder, but far more with things like family matters, employment, crime, neighbors, public services, and I think especially land issues. We must not forget this, it's crucial. For most citizens in those countries, it is not a matter of how much justice you can get, but how much injustice you can live with. And in order to improve the lives of these ordinary people, solutions need to be focused on the concrete problems these people face in their daily lives, because that makes a difference, and it resolves conflicts. For instance, if you look at Afghanistan, about 87% of the women in Afghanistan indicate that they suffer from domestic or sexual violence in their lifetime. Where can they go to complain? Where can they go to feel safe? Are there any specialized units available within the office of the prosecutor? Can they flee to a shelter? All of these questions are important. Well, of course, don't get me wrong, reform of justice institutions is also needed. The justice system should always be able to settle disputes relating to the lawful exercise of state power. And power for elites, private actors and individuals should not stand above the law. A couple of years ago, Douglas North wrote a book, and probably a lot of you have read it, on violence and social orders. And he picked out two issues that are crucial for countries to make the jump from developing countries to developed countries and to have a development trajectory that really is sustainable. And these two issues, two of the three I think it were, perpetual institutions and rule of law for all. Those were two crucial factors. Perpetual institutions, not depending on any individual, but even if an individual would move out, the organization could still continue with other personnel and other people. And rule of law for all, especially with regard to elites being bound by rule of law and sticking to the rule of law that is available and that is applicable to everyone. At the same time, we know that the justice sector reform is not a short-term thing. It is a long-term commitment. And the World Bank actually tells us that if you put a figure on it, you have to take between 18 and 40 years in order to rebuild state institutions to become effective and legitimate. That is a very long time. Difficult to deal with from a policy point of view, because I've never seen a minister that will survive a period of time like that. So you have to deal with changes in government all the time. And finally, after a conflict or after a dictatorship ends, during which massive human rights violations were committed, it is crucial to achieve lasting peace that the truth should be revealed and perpetrators are held to account, either in criminal law or in some other way. And that victims should be eligible for reparations or compensation. Now, we all know this under the term transitional justice, a crucial element of our rule of law policies. A prominent recent example of that is Colombia, I think, where the government and the FARC have committed to a comprehensive transitional package as part of the peace agreement. And this includes a special jurisdiction for peace, which can try both FARC leaders as well as state actors who committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. And Colombia also has a far-reaching victims law, which gives compensation and assistance to victims. Now, personally, I was placed as part of the embassy in South Africa from 1991 to 1994, and I witnessed the start of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And I really felt in society how important that exercise was. Now, South Africa may be a unique case, and I think every country is a unique case. But I think that commission was crucial in getting the country to come to peace with itself, despite all of the problems that it met.
Yep.
But it was a crucial step.
Yep.
And I think that's also something worthwhile of support.
So what you're saying is, I mean, citizen at the heart. One element I also pick out is this need for multi-stakeholder in approaches to things. Citizens have many different needs. So, I mean, it's all quite complex. So let's turn now maybe to how do you then do it?
Yeah.
Because it's clearly not an easy task. Could you share with us some ideas on how the Dutch government, how your department actually approaches doing this, especially I think from the vantage point that you have as a ministry official, as a body that could coordinate, bring together, fund. I mean, it's a very special role, I would say.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think there's no written law for that, and that's deliberate, because we are completely convinced that finding solutions for problems in a country or in a region have to be context-specific always.
Yeah.
And that means that you have to really know in which context you are intervening, what you are doing, and put enough energy and resources into finding out, if you don't know, about what are the problems on the ground here and where are the sentiments and how is the power division being dealt with. But you know, we are working in some of the world's most challenging places, and that's absolutely true, but we don't have a choice. Because these are the places where support is required, but also support is deserved. And at the same time, we are also under political pressure at home of showing results of the input of our money, because you know, our money doesn't come for free, it's taxpayers' money, so we have to report on the results. So this brings us in a very difficult, challenging environment, where sometimes results take a long time to become clear, and at the same time there is short-term pressure on us to show the results as we go along. So, and again, I think if you work in challenging environments, especially with unstable political situations, you are bound along the long term to be confronted with setbacks and with short bursts of energy going forward, and then to have a political backlash which takes you back a while. And there's always a danger of these two things, the internal situation in the Netherlands and the external developments in the country we work in, to become at loggerheads. And we've had that a number of times. And it's our job then to try and convince people that staying with it for the long term, despite these setbacks, is crucial in coming to the final result that everybody wants to achieve. But it's challenging. And at the same time, there are a couple of elements which I would like to bring forward that are of crucial importance for an effective rule of law strategy as part of our stabilization policies. The first one is on data, and I mentioned already the kind of data that we need to become aware of what ordinary citizens want, what their perceptions of the situation is, and how they think interventions could be done. Yep. At the same time, this has to be balanced and counterbalanced with the views of the government in place, because we are a government and we work with governments on the other side. And that's a challenging point as well. There is more need to put work into surveys to find out the scale of demands, the needs, etc., etc. Innovation, I mentioned it before, but I personally really believe in the need for innovative approaches, and I think your organization is one of the organizations who has the same belief. That's why we cooperate so much on these things. Looking at things in a completely different way, changing the paradigms of your reality, being courageous in trying things out and allowing it to fail if it doesn't work. That's the only way to get to something which really works well. But rule of law, I think, is a sector that can particularly benefit from innovation. Maybe due to the fact that in rule of law we are dealing with rules, laws, judges, lawyers. We can have a tendency to be organized in a top-down way. And in rule of law, we need to change that culture over time to become more focused on bottom-up approaches, and therefore allowing these bottom-up approaches to show themselves, prove themselves, maybe fail, get up on your feet and start all over again in a different way. I think that's very important to come to effective policies. We will not reform legal systems by writing new laws, building new courts and prisons, and training judges and lawyers. It's simply not enough. We need to empower the end users of legal services to take matters into their own hands. Small initiatives may be needed to be scaled up. Now, for instance, in countries as Kenya, people ask and receive legal advice via SMS services right now. That is an important innovation which brings justice to the people. People don't have to go to court or to a lawyer to do that. Another issue which I think is crucial for innovation and for successful policies is vision. And that is connected to leadership. Leadership, I think, at all levels, international levels, national and local. The new type of leadership that sets clear goals, that keeps the needs of citizens I spoke of before at the core, that provides a safe space for innovation, that promotes iterative approaches, risk-taking, learning, and a networked rather than a hierarchical way of working. And at the same time, we need a broad vision for the way forward. Rule of law is an important part of prevention and achieving sustainable peace. under the SDGs, governments should perceive of legal services as a basic service, similar to education or health. And in many countries, legal services suffer from chronic underspending due to very low allocations of national budgets. Donor funding in the justice sector, it's the same story. Historically, the justice sector reform issues have been getting comparatively low budgetary allocations. For instance, in the period 2005-2013, justice sector funding comprised only 1.8% of total aid flows. By comparison, 7.4% and 7.5% for health and education sectors, respectively. The SDGs, and especially SDG 16, can help to prevent and correct this, and I think it is needed. But we also need innovation in other fields, like financing, becoming more aware of innovative financing mechanisms that can really make more money out of your investment. Partnerships, and I mentioned the private sector before. I think we've gone past the situation where the private sector was seen as just another ATM machine to get money from. That doesn't work. But there are many opportunities to allow the private sector to do what they're good at, making money, solving problems, and teaming up with aid organizations and countries and organizations to work for the better of a social problem in a country. And they're perfectly willing to do so, if they are allowed to do what they are good at.
That's critical.
And the final one, I think, is flexibility. I think we have a history in the aid world of being rather inflexible with regard to what we fund. You know, we always want to know in advance what are the results are you going to reach, what is the trajectory, when are you going to be having the need for money, and can you please plan that out in a period of 4 years for us? This is not the way forward. You know, these log frame sort of approaches are something of the past. We need to go to a far more iterative way of working, finding concrete solutions and options at a given time and jumping on it and using them. And instead, on the other way around, if we have a difficult period, we might want to back down a bit for a while and then restart again in a different way. So there will be setbacks, as I said, mostly from a political point of view, but we need to be able to learn and adapt as we go along. And we have to admit when things are not working. Don't be shy about that. It's a big shame still in the civil service, you know, to admit that you've done something which didn't work. Get rid of that. And I think we just be open about failures because we can learn from these failures. And these lessons are very valuable. And we have to draw knowledge from many different sources and disciplines to resolve some of the most complex problems that we have to deal with in the world. We also need to adapt our frameworks and financial instruments to allow for flexibility. Rule of law, and I would just like to conclude with that, rule of law to me is too important to be left to lawyers alone.
Hear, hear. And I must say, I'm also very happy to hear from you that log frames are a bad thing. One of the reasons why I missed some of the sessions this afternoon is because I was on a 1.5-hour call on trying, with another donor, not the Dutch, trying to fit an innovation program into a log frame. And I must say, that's very, very difficult. Yeah. We have maybe 10 more minutes for some questions from the audience, if they are there. And I already see a few hands. Sir, you were first. Maybe you could stand up briefly, state your name, and ask a short question. And I would ask everyone to keep it brief so we have time for as many as possible. No long statements, please. Sir, you have the floor.
The question I would like to ask is, my name is Mansoussi, Deputy Speaker of Senegalese Parliament. All the principle, the conversation you're making, international organization like United Nations, like World Bank, FAO, has been set up to solve those very problems. Whenever I visit them, I did the pile of files and etc., and no problem has been solved. How do you expect, where the United Nations and World Bank failed to solve those problems, how do you expect from your side to be able to solve them? Thank you.
Okay. Do you mind if I take just 2 questions and then?
That's fine, and you have to remember me if I get one.
I'll remember you. No so how will you succeed? How will we succeed where the UN has not succeeded? Let's just take one more question over there. Yes, please.
Penny Bright, New Zealand. Don't we already have a document that puts the citizen at its core? Nearly 60 years old, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Are we not all together human beings? And in terms of stability, do we not have the underpinning UN Charter, which is supposed to ensure that countries do not attack other countries, that they respect the sovereignty of nation states?
Your question.
And that's the question. I'm saying, do you not agree we've already got these documents?
Okay,
There's 60.
clear.
Why throw the baby out with the bathwater?
Right.
Thank you very much. So there's two questions relating to international organizations.
Yeah,
Jelte,
well, they
please.
both touch upon a very crucial issue that I think needs some explanation. Because you're both absolutely right. I mean, we're dealing with organizations that have been created after the Second World War to upkeep things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as solve some of the world's problems and diffuse and solve conflicts in the world. However, we are dealing with a world that is developing in a way in which these organizations cannot keep up with. Because all of these institutions that we've created together have been built on the reality of 1945-46. And that was a completely different reality from what we have right now. If you look, for instance, into conflict issues, the major players in these conflict issues are now completely different from what they were in the 1950s or 1940s of the last century. And how to deal with these players that have no message at all to Universal Declaration of Human Rights or international humanitarian law, that do not respect the authority of the UN as a world leadership organization capable and mandated to help solve conflicts. They take their own decisions and they just throw the rest into the wind. We have to deal with that. And I think some of the institutions that are now still there, like the UN Security Council, to deal with these problems are built on fundamental principles that have been overtaken by reality. And at the same time, there is no political convergence in the world to change these institutions in such a way that they become more effective. If you would start a discussion on reform of the UN Security Council right now, you would be stuck from moment one for political reasons, because of the division of views in the international political arena. It doesn't really go anywhere. What I tell my people in my department, because we also feel that these institutions need to reform and change, become more effective, innovate, and do some of the stuff that I've just been talking about. I tell them, if you try and reform them through the front door of your political negotiations and your councils and all of the big institutional whatever you have for these UN organizations, World Bank, etc., you won't get very far. But there's an alternative way. You can reform them through the back door. For instance, one of the ways to do that is to try and push for complete transparency on what they do and every single step of the way. If everybody in the world would know what the financial flows within UN organizations would be and what results they achieve from the actions that they pay from these financial flows, then the whole world can be the judge of whether or not they are effective and efficient. And there is nothing, internationally, politically speaking, against a push for more transparency. Everybody wants that. So if you push them in that direction, and that's what we're actually doing, if you push them into that direction, you don't need the Security Council, you don't need a governing council of a UN body to correct you because there's political divisions there, and you do it in a much more flexible way. But to come back to the Universal Declaration, I think you're absolutely right. We have the fundamental principles laid out there. The only problem that we're witnessing is that there are many people in the world that might not agree completely to the universality of these principles. Maybe their states do, but individual groups, like ISIS right now, they don't care. They've got a completely different concept of what they think is acceptable. And there again, you come into problems in solving conflicts based on these principles because the principles are not recognized. So we need to find more flexible ways to deal with that and therefore become more innovative.
Room for one more question. And I see two hands. I don't know how I'm going to solve that. Maybe these two people could ask their questions one after the other very, very quickly. Right over there. But really make them very quick.
Thank you very much. I'm Nikki from Myanmar, and I'd like to ask about Myanmar is just right now transition to democracy, and our great leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, always talk about rule of law is very important to democracy, democratization. So my question is how international community like Dutch, Netherlands government can help Myanmar to deepen rule of law culture in Myanmar. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
I have a very short question. My name is David Esiam. I'm from Ghana. My question is, errors are painful, particularly now when the digital evidence of failure is both accessible and indelible, but they are also inevitable. The trick there is to err well, to recognize mistakes and learn from them. Worryingly, humanity may not be getting worse at owning up to its own goose. Will rule of law win, or rule of law is fighting a lost battle? Is there a way rule of law could correct this? Thank you.
Thank you. I think in specific terms, we as a government, of course, have resources available for rule of law support, but it's limited. So in the past, we've already made choices with regard to the countries that we cooperate with in terms of rule of law programming. We can't be active everywhere. It's simply not possible. However, we are also involved, for instance, in worldwide programs through bigger institutions like the United Nations in trying to promote rule of law and legal reform issues in other countries than we are dealing with in a bilateral way. So we have a broader palette. But still, if you look at, for instance, our bilateral programming, we have in our development policies 15 so-called partner countries. All of these partner countries have at least 2 sectors where we are cooperating with them, and 10 out of the 15 we work on security and justice issues. So, and these are the countries, as I said, we need to have a long-term perspective, so we choose the long-term approach in these countries and deal with them and their governments in accordingly. So it's not very easy for us to say, okay, we're going to stop in this country and now move to another one, because a long-term commitment is absolutely necessary. But once again, there are institutions that work in a more global way and are not necessarily bound by our restrictions, but still use our money to do that. So I think there are many possibilities, maybe not on a bilateral sphere between us and the government of Myanmar, although we would like to, because it's absolutely needed, as you absolutely said. And if it can work there, it makes a big difference for people in Myanmar. But we are restricted by that. The second question, help me again.
The second question, I think, was verged on the existential. It was basically you asked, is it possible, right? Rule of law. I think it is a valid question, important question,
right.
But it's a big one, not for 5 minutes.
It is a big one, and I think it will be also a question where any answer that I would give would be sort of measured against the results in 10 years' time, and I would be probably wrong in all accounts. But personally, I have a very optimistic character. Otherwise, I wouldn't do this job. Sometimes I tell to my people, working on humanitarian issues, migration issues, and rule of law and stability issues, I tell my people in my department, you are doing a very sloppy job, because since you've been doing this, the situation has only gone worse. But that's not fair. That's not fair, because I have excellent people, and we really achieve results. Personally, I feel that the value of rule of law, meaning everybody, including elites in a country, sticking to rule of law principles, so that there is no difference whether you're part of the elite or whether you're an ordinary citizen in a country, in dealing with justice issues and settlement of conflicts, will remain a basic principle of development and progress, whatever may happen. It doesn't change. And I think there are many cases in the world and situations in the world, despite all the problems and the conflicts that we nowadays see, where results can be achieved and where progress can be made and is made at this particular moment. We know that from the programs that we do and the results that we are documenting and reporting upon. So I'm not negative on these things. I'm not negative that rule of law is making a difference in day-to-day lives. And as I said before, I think one of the crucial issues is that we have this very, very important international agreement on peaceful and just societies in SDG 16, which puts us on a platform with many more countries right now to have an honest discussion about what they can do in their own country about creating these societies that are at peace with themselves. And always, rule of law will be crucial in those countries.
Well, with that, I would like to end. Jelte, thank you very much for not being a traditional diplomat,
Pleasure.
for being as open as you have been with us about your worries, your concerns, your ambitions, and everything else. We will allow you to fail. Do not worry, because we know that you will slowly, we will get somewhere at a better place. Let's have a big round of applause for Jelte. And with that, I end this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.